Imagine a doomsday scenario where civilization doesn't collapse because we ran out of resources. I mean, we still have plenty of solar power, plenty of raw materials. It collapses because we ran out of time. Time to understand the resources we already had. We didn't run out of fuel. We simply ran out of the collective brain power to process the knowledge we ourselves were creating. That concept that humanity's greatest threat isn't scarcity, but an overwhelming abundance of information, that's the chilling idea we're exploring today. We are taking a truly deep dive into the mind of Stanislaw Lem, the Polish genius whose work, so often blurred the line between science fiction and deep philosophy. Our source material is centered on his prophetic 1964 nonfiction masterpiece, Summa Technology, and specifically Chapter 4, Intellectronics, and the looming threat he dubbed the Megabit Bomb.
And the sources we're looking at today, they present a really radical claim, both philosophically and technically. This is far beyond your standard futurism or, technological forecasting. Lem delivers this incredibly dense, highly systematic, but also just utterly imaginative look at the limits of scientific growth itself.
So he's not talking about hitting peak oil.
No, not at all. He's arguing that those kinds of constraints, the ones we traditionally fear, are actually secondary concerns. They're a distraction. They mask a much deeper, more fundamental bottleneck.
And that bottleneck, as he sees it, is entirely cognitive. It's not a lack of power. It's a lack of information processing capability. So we're not hitting an energy wall. We're hitting a data wall.
Precisely.
Sure.
And so the core mission of this deep dive is to unpack Lem's really radical claim that civilization is just hurtling toward an information barrier, a point where the sheer volume of data exceeds our ability to manage it. We need to understand what that means for our scientific strategy, for how we allocate human talent, and how we have to fundamentally redefine our relationship with knowledge itself.
Okay, let's unpack this. And I think we have to start with the most dramatic analogy he offers. Lem kicks this all off with a really jarring comparison. He looks at civilization and its accelerating scientific growth, and he compares it to a supernova.
Yeah, it's an analogy that's designed to shock you, but it contains a very rigorous premise underneath it. Think about a massive star. For most of its life, it's in this expansive equilibrium. It burns its nuclear fuel, creating heavier elements, in a steady chain reaction. But when it reaches that critical point, when it starts to exhaust its core fuel, that reaction just accelerates wildly. It consumes everything left in an explosive burst, and then it undergoes a sudden catastrophic collapse.
Okay, so how does that map onto civilization?
Well, Lem suggests that we're engaged in an analogous but intellectual chain reaction. We're expanding our scientific front exponentially, and we're consuming our intellectual fuel, which is, human capital. Scientists, researchers, their output. And we're doing it at an accelerating rate. The output is information, which in turn fuels the need for more scientists.
So instead of burning through hydrogen, we're burning through our finite ability to train and deploy knowledgeable people fast enough to sustain that acceleration. It's an intellectual explosion that consumes its own structure, leading to what? A collapse.
Eventual systemic collapse, or at least a radical, unrecognizable transformation. That's the core model. And as you can probably guess, this is where the skeptics immediately push back.
Right, because it feels a little excessive. Why assume catastrophe? What's the counter-argument?
The standard sort of optimistic critique goes like this. Look, science is expanding, sure, but there's a natural limit to human talent. Once science reaches saturation, meaning everyone who has the aptitude is already doing research, the exponential growth just stops. It becomes proportional to population growth.
A controlled, steady burn instead of a supernova.
Exactly. And that argument relies really heavily on the idea of rational planning. The skeptic says that even at this slower, sustainable rate, any really vital challenge like fusion power or curing a major disease would still get the resources it needs. Governments and organizations would just rationally plan for it. They'd make sure the crucial fronts of science are fully staffed. So no collapse, the lights would just dim gracefully, and we'd solve problems a bit more slowly.
But Lem doesn't buy that. He rejects this idea that rational planning can save us. Why? If we see the crisis coming, why can't we just organize our way out of it?
Because the information you need for that perfect rational planning is itself part of the problem. Lem insists the analogy holds because he sees a fundamental difference between a star and a civilization. And that difference actually makes the crisis worse, not better.
Okay, what's the difference?
A star is, at the end of the day, only an energetic machine. Its path is highly determined by physics. It's a cosmic pressure cooker. It turns matter into energy. Full stop. A civilization, though, is a dual system. It's an energetic machine and an informational machine. The energetic system is about power, resources, infrastructure. The informational system is about knowledge, complexity, and synthesis.
And the complexity of how those two systems interact is where the rational planning argument falls apart.
Precisely. Lem makes this really powerful claim about what he calls energetic freedom. I mean, in principle, humanity has access to near infinite power. Solar, stellar, geothermal. The cosmos is just full of usable energy. So in theory, we shouldn't ever have to worry about running out of fuel.
But there's a catch. That theoretical freedom is entirely dependent on one thing.
It only exists until civilization hits the informational barrier. We can only access the power of the sun or the power of fusion if we have the blueprints, the operational knowledge, the technology to actually harness it. The moment our information acquisition stalls, that energetic freedom just vanishes. It becomes a mirage.
So the strategic focus has to shift completely. We stop worrying about the scarcity of atoms and we start worrying exclusively about the scarcity of actionable knowledge. The universe has all the power we need, but we haven't learned to read the instruction manual yet.
And the incredible risk, according to Lem, is that we might only figure out how to read the manual after we've already lost the informational capacity to do so, which means the strategic focus of civilization has to shift entirely toward maximizing knowledge acquisition. And time. Time is the most critical constraint of all.
That link between energy and information becomes the absolute core of his argument. So let's look at the history of our energy transitions through this lens, not as engineering problems, but as information hurdles we had to overcome.
Historically, civilization's progress has been marked by these huge shifts in power sources. From water and wind to coal and oil and now to atomic energy. None of these were simple swaps. They required massive societal and intellectual shifts. This leads to what Lem calls the rule of the critical point. The transition to a new energy source and all the technology that goes with it only becomes viable when the necessary body of information crosses a specific, measurable, critical point. Before that point, the energy is there, physically, but is practically inaccessible.
Right. Coal was in the ground for millennia, but it only became the engine of the Industrial Revolution once we crossed that critical point of information about steam and metallurgy and mining logistics.
Exactly. You needed the information to build the engine and the information to fuel it. Now, the urgency of Lem's argument really comes into focus when we look at our current transition, the move to atomic energy.
And even the move to heavy atomic energy, fission, was incredibly information intensive.
Oh, it was a massive leap. The splitting of heavy nuclei like uranium required an unprecedented industrial scale, enormous power inputs just to enrich the fuel, and highly specialized labs that needed immense computational and intellectual effort. We are still, globally, not really set up for a total transition to fission power.
And the source material highlights this terrifyingly short timeline on fission itself, given how fast we're consuming energy.
Yes, Lem's analysis is stark. He says that given the pace of exponential growth in global power consumption, our current use of heavy atomic energy would lead to us effectively burning up all accessible uranium, thorium, and related elements within just 1 to 2 centuries.
That's nothing. That's a geological blink of an eye.
It is. If we stay on this path without a successful next step, we risk running out of the most powerful energy source we've managed to crack so far. And that puts all the pressure on the next critical step. Fusion energy. This is the goal, right? Converting hydrogen to helium, the power of the sun on Earth. But achieving stable, net positive fusion has proven to be exponentially more difficult than anyone projected back in the 60s or 70s. It requires information at a scale that was previously unimaginable.
So fusion is the high-stakes information hurdle we absolutely have to clear. But the goalposts for that information keep moving further and further away. It proves just how high the barrier really is.
And this is what forces Lem to define these dual requirements for civilizational survival. These have to become the primary strategic mandate, overriding everything else.
What are they? Let's detail them.
Okay, the first requirement is about energy reserves as a buffer. Civilization needs significant accessible energy sources, even older, less efficient ones, to act as a massive buffer of time. These reserves, by the time you need to run the labs, build the particle accelerators, and operate the computers required to get the information that will finally open the gate to the next energy source. You can't solve the problem if you can't keep the lights on while you're thinking.
That makes perfect sense. And the second requirement, it's about our priorities as a society.
Exactly. The second mandate is the absolute elevation of information gathering. Civilization must make the task of acquiring this new critical information, the blueprints for the next transition, the principal task overriding all others. It has to be seen as more important than political squabbles or economic maneuvering. If the funding for that key information gets diluted, the whole project stalls.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Because the existential risk isn't famine or war, it's just exhaustion. If we fail these dual requirements, if we burn through our energy buffer or the information gathering process gets bogged down, we risk using up all our accessible energy before we learn how to tap into the infinite kind. We could fail by being just short of success.
And this instability is amplified by something he calls the hidden cost of information.
The hidden cost. What does he mean by that? Why is getting new information getting more expensive in terms of energy?
Well, if you look at history, the energy expenditures required for obtaining new information increased dramatically with each transition. Think about the resources needed to understand the atom versus, say, the resources needed to understand a steam engine. To get the information for coal power, you needed engineers, basic steel, and relatively small-scale experiments. To get to fission, you needed enormous power plants, rare earth materials, complex magnetic fields, supercomputers for modeling, a massive global intellectual network.
And fusion is even worse.
Oh, orders of magnitude worse. It requires running experimental reactors like ITER, which themselves consume colossal amounts of energy. They generate terabytes of complex data that require even more immense computational power just to analyze. The cost of getting the next breakthrough is orders of magnitude greater than the cost of the last one, in both money and just raw energy input.
It's a vicious cycle. We need information to get energy, but getting that information costs an ever-increasing amount of the energy we already have. And if our current energy reserve is finite, and the cost of the next big answer is rising exponentially, the whole system is speeding towards a breaking point defined by knowledge debt.
The source material makes this point unequivocally. The absolute key to all knowledge reserves, and by extension all energy reserves, is information. If the informational system chokes, everything else collapses, no matter how much oil or uranium we physically have left in the ground.
This realization just completely recenters the whole discussion on the information system itself. If the system is choking, we need to understand the mechanism, and Lem uses the lens of cybernetics to explain why our success leads directly to our failure.
Right. Cybernetics, which was really cutting edge in the 1960s, is crucial to understanding Lem's thinking. He saw the whole scientific establishment not just as a collection of brilliant minds, but as a giant, complex, self-regulating communication system. Science acts as the main communication channel connecting civilization to the outside world, the nature we study, and also to itself through sociology and human studies.
And if science is a communication channel, then scientific growth has to be viewed in terms of bandwidth.
Exactly. The amount of information that needs to be transmitted, all the raw data, the theories, the experimental results, the peer reviews, it's all growing exponentially. To keep up with this data flood, civilization has to continuously and exponentially increase the throughput capacity or the bandwidth of that science channel.
So how does a civilization increase its scientific bandwidth?
The main way is through the parallel connection of new channels. Since the human mind is still the ultimate processing unit, increasing that capacity means training and deploying more specialized scientists, more researchers, more technicians. This is what's been driving the exponential growth in the global population of researchers since the Industrial Revolution.
You just add more lanes to the highway.
You add more lanes. If one team can process X amount of plasma physics data, then 10 teams can theoretically process 10x. But this is where the system starts to eat itself, because scaling up creates a positive feedback loop that runs away from any kind of human control.
Okay, break down that feedback loop.
It's the classic definition of a positive feedback loop. Training new scientists increases the throughput, which lets more data be processed and more experiments be run. However, those new scientists don't just passively process data, they generate even more new information, their own findings, their papers, their dissertations. And this larger new body of information then requires an even greater capacity for transmission and processing, which demands the training of, well, even more new scientists.
It's a perpetual self-fueling acceleration. More researchers generate more information, which demands more researchers to manage it, which generates even more information. That sounds great until you hit a physical limit.
And Lem argues that the system is fundamentally limited by human constraints. Time, education, specialization. There's a physical limit to how many people can be educated to the required level of expertise, a limit to how many hours they can work, a limit to how much information one human brain can meaningfully synthesize.
Right.
Think about cognitive cost. As knowledge explodes, researchers are forced into narrower and narrower specializations. No single person can comprehend the full front of science anymore. And this fragmentation, this micro-specialization, actually undermines the system's efficiency because the vital connections between fields, say, material science and genetics, start to get lost.
So the very act of trying to scale up the research capacity introduces these new inefficiencies: bureaucracy, communication silos, things that slow down the process of turning raw data into useful knowledge.
Exactly. The result is a state where the ability to maintain the throughput of science at the pace dictated by the informational growth itself becomes impossible. The system can no longer sustainably expand its human input at the required exponential rate.
And that structural inability to keep pace, that's the information barrier. That's the megabit bomb detonating, not with a bang, but with a cognitive traffic jam. And the moment we hit that traffic jam, the core strategy of science, which Lem sees as probabilistic, just completely breaks down. Why does he characterize discovery as being probabilistic, like a genetic mutation?
Because scientific discovery isn't a guaranteed linear process. It's often trial and error and just serendipity. When you're working in complex new fields, which is where the breakthroughs for the next energy source have to come from, we almost never know for sure which line of research will pay off. We only know where we're looking, not what we're going to find.
Like genetic mutations.
Precisely. Most mutations are useless or even harmful. But that rare, decisive, valuable mutation is what drives evolution forward. In the same way, the accidental discovery penicillin X-rays is what can suddenly shift the entire trajectory of civilization.
So if the big breakthroughs are accidental, what's the only rational strategy for civilization to adopt?
Well, if nothing is known for sure beforehand, then the only feasible strategy is to research everything possible. This forces science to expand comprehensively. We have to cover the widest possible research front to maximize the chances of a useful mutation happening in some lab, somewhere. The probability of making those essential discoveries goes up with the sheer number of researchers and the breadth of fields being investigated at the same time.
Which means if we're forced to start skipping areas of research, we are literally gambling with our own future. We risk missing the one accidental breakthrough we desperately need.
We are. And this is where Lem introduces the most damning piece of evidence for this impending barrier. He calls it the discovery ratio problem. This is the key numerical crisis that proves the thinning of our intellectual capacity.
Okay, let's break that down. This is the data that underpins the whole idea of a structural failure.
The empirical observation is this. Since the Industrial Revolution, the number of scientists worldwide has been doubling approximately every 10 years, which confirms this huge, accelerating growth of human capital input. We are widening the channel.
Right.
However, when Lem analyzed the output, the number of actual, valuable, groundbreaking discoveries, he found that number was only doubling every 30 years.
Wait, say that again? Scientists double every 10 years, but discoveries only double every 30.
That's the staggering disparity. The input of human capital is growing 3 times faster than the output of truly revolutionary knowledge. We're investing so many more people every decade, but we're only getting a fraction of the corresponding breakthrough return.
It creates this massive widening gap between the human effort we're putting in and the actionable insight we're getting out.
It does. And while the total volume of all scientific information is still growing exponentially, the growth rate of the really impactful paradigm-shifting discoveries has a much, much smaller exponent than the growth rate of the researchers themselves.
So why the lag? I mean, if you double the number of researchers, shouldn't you at least double the potential for a breakthrough?
No, because discoveries make up only a tiny fraction of the total informational output of the scientific machine. The vast majority of the output, which consumes the researcher's time and the system's energy, is what you might call noise or incremental work.
What does that noise consist of?
Think about it. Failed experiments, replication studies that don't show anything new, niche analyses buried in obscure journals, and, critically, the mountains of academic output required just for getting a credential. The source specifically mentions the dusty piles of archived dissertations research done primarily to get a degree, which yields very little in the way of valuable results.
So we're doubling the academic bureaucracy and the archival noise much faster than we're doubling the fundamental insights. The system is just consuming itself by generating information that's increasingly difficult to process, drowning out the few vital signals.
The ultimate consequence is a constant diminishing return on intellectual investment. Even though we're adding more brilliant minds every decade, the percentage of their time that they have to spend just reading, processing, and filtering the pre-existing avalanche of data, the noise, is eating into the time they have left for genuine, groundbreaking research.
I see.
So when we hit that information capacity limit, the probability of making those necessary, valuable discoveries doesn't just level off. It begins to decrease substantially over time. The actual growth curve of scientists is forced into an S shape, falling away from the impossible exponential curve needed to maintain the discovery pace. We become structurally predisposed to intellectual stagnation, even while we're working harder than ever.
The moment that growth curve of valuable discoveries falls so far below the growth curve of complexity, the whole system just loses efficiency. We're losing ground faster than we're gaining it.
That loss of ground becomes systemic because our human throughput capacity is maxed out and the efficiency of each researcher is diluted by all that noise. The probability of finding the next big thing, fusion, a solution to antibiotic resistance, it gets progressively lower year after year.
Okay, we need to make this tangible. Let's use the chain of soldiers analogy to really visualize this gap between the research we need and the capacity we have.
Okay, so visualize the entire scientific research front as an ever-expanding battlefield. It's potentially infinite. In the ideal fictional scenario, the one we'd need to keep up, a chain of soldiers, representing our scientists, advances across this front. And crucially, the distance between any two soldiers stays constant because new recruits are joining at the required exponential rate. Every sector of the front is covered.
That's the utopian model of science. Maximum coverage, no gaps.
But the actual Lemsine scenario is the thinning out. As the required research front stretches wider and wider, the available chain of soldiers becomes increasingly rare. The distance between them just expands year after year. Vast, critical, and necessary sectors of the research map are left completely untouched, unexamined, undefended.
And those gaps, those untouched sectors, they start to accumulate unaddressed research. And this falls into two categories, right? Both are really destabilizing.
Our first category is what you call the unknown unknowns. These are investigations that were never even attempted because the very possibility of them was outside our current frame of knowledge. We don't know that X is possible, so we don't look for it. The second category is far more dangerous because it's a conscious failure. It's caused by systemic strain. It's the intentionally bypassed research. These are fields. Lem just labels them abstractly as R, S, T, V, W, Z that the scientific community knows are necessary steps toward a major breakthrough. R might be, say, a specific line of quantum computing hardware design. S might be a huge long-term study on deep-sea ecology vital for climate modeling. T might be some high-risk, high-reward battery chemistry research.
So we know we need to research R, S, and T, but because the chain of soldiers is too thin because of the shortage of scientists, the system is forced to prioritize. It might fund R, but it has to skip S and T, basically betting that R will provide a shortcut.
And that bet is a massive risk. Because breakthroughs are probabilistic, skipping S and T might mean we missed the critical piece of information that was needed to actually make R functional. The thinning chain forces us to take these enormous gambles on narrow, focused efforts, instead of maintaining the broad coverage required to guarantee progress.
The ultimate irony is that the informational avalanche, which forced us to train more people than ever, is the very thing that causes this collapse of intellectual coverage. It leaves us with these massive, potentially fatal gaps in our knowledge.
And the consequence of these systemic gaps is a direct threat to civilization's fundamental stability, what he calls its homeostatic equilibrium.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, what does he mean by homeostatic equilibrium in this context?
Well, in biology, homeostasis is an organism's ability to maintain stable internal conditions despite changes in the outside world. For a civilization, it means the ability to continuously adapt and solve existential problems as they come up, energy crises, pandemics, resource depletion, and thereby maintain a steady, resilient state.
And groundbreaking research is the engine of that adaptability.
It is. The valuable rare genetic mutation is what provides the system with novel solutions. If civilization loses its pressure of discoveries, its reserve of mutational pressure, its core ability to generate new responses just declines rapidly.
So the megabit bomb means we become intellectually rigid. The problems keep growing exponentially, but our capacity to solve them just plateaus or even shrinks. And that leads to a profound instability where we can no longer adapt quickly enough.
The decrease in the discovery gradient directly threatens stability. We reach a point where problems outpace solutions and the system spirals towards collapse, or, at best, a radical forced restructuring.
The vision we've explored is Well, it's one where collapse is an internal systemic failure. It's a choking on success. It's a diagnosis that suggests all our traditional worries, money, politics are misplaced. They're just symptoms of this underlying cognitive crisis.
Yeah.
So if the decrease in that discovery gradient leads to this profound instability, civilization has one overriding task. It has to take radical preemptive measures to change the sign of that gradient, to somehow force the probability of valuable discovery back up, no matter what the informational volume is.
And this is where Lem, writing as a cyberneticist, offers his solution, a radical bypass of the human cognitive bottleneck.
The creation of the great brain.
Precisely. The solution he puts forward is the creation of artificial researchers, what we would now call AIs, specializing in discovery and synthesis. These would be information generators and transmitters, machines capable of processing, synthesizing, and creating new knowledge at the pace required by the informational avalanche, freeing up human intellect from the sheer volume of data filtration. If the human brain is the limiting factor, then the bottleneck has to be bypassed through artificial, non-biological means.
So the goal isn't to replace human curiosity, but to automate the filtering and synthesis of all that exponential noise, to return the human scientist to the front line of actual discovery.
That's the optimistic outcome. The alternative implication is that development beyond the information barrier might lead to civilizational processes that are completely unrecognizable to us. The entity that successfully manages this informational load might be a highly distributed, non-human intelligence, one that can manage vast data flows without our human constraints of specialization, time, and, distraction. The civilization that survives this transition might not even be defined by its human component anymore.
And the most urgent and frankly the most unsettling aspect of this whole vision is Lem's timeline. This isn't some distant theoretical problem.
No. The only thing about this grand vision that Lem insisted was not fantasy was the existence of that S-shaped inflection point, the inevitable slowdown of the exponential growth curve. He estimated the arrival of this sharp decline, this critical phase where the informational barrier would be fully manifest, to be only 30 to 70 years away from the time he was writing.
And Summa Technology was published in 1964. So we are right in the thick of Lem's predicted crisis zone right now. We should be seeing the symptoms of the thinning chain everywhere. Massive scientific output coupled with a growing sense that the foundational paradigm-shifting breakthroughs have slowed down since the mid-20th century.
We should be living in the era where R, S, T, B, W, and Z are being bypassed. Not because we don't know we need the answers, but because the global scientific community is overwhelmed, fragmented, and structurally incapable of covering all the necessary fronts at once. Our specialized soldiers are standing miles apart on the battlefield.
This raises an important question. So what does this all mean for you? Lem suggests that the constraints we perceive as energetic or political or economic are just the surface ripples of a fundamental systemic limit on our ability to process our own output. If that's true, the primary strategic resource isn't oil or political stability. It's focused, undistracted intellectual capacity and the development of tools, cybernetic or otherwise, to augment that capacity.
And that leads directly to the crucial concluding thought. If we are already past the inflection point, what research fields, the necessary complex, expensive, high-risk endeavors that would unlock the next energy transition or secure our homeostatic equilibrium, are we unconsciously skipping right now? Are we being forced to focus all our available intellectual soldiers on the easily quantifiable, profitable parts of the battlefield, while the genuinely crucial, life-changing breakthroughs are accumulating in the vast, ignored, and informationally dense spaces we can no longer afford to staff?